He thought he could ruin her quietly, behind polished doors and polite smiles, but he had no idea that by sunrise, his own name would be the one people whispered about in disbelief. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Langston Tower gleamed under soft white lighting, the kind that made everything look expensive and controlled, and Victor Langston stood at the head of the long glass table like a man who had never once been questioned in his life. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his silver watch catching just enough light to remind everyone in the room exactly who held power here. Around him, executives sat straight-backed, laptops open, eyes alert, waiting for his approval, his nod, his signal to breathe. And then there was Clara Whitmore, seated halfway down the table, her gray cardigan folded neatly over the back of her chair, a simple notebook in front of her, her pen resting quietly between steady fingers. She looked like she didn't belong in a room where decisions shaped millions of dollars in headlines. And that was exactly what Victor had already decided the moment he noticed her. He hadn't bothered to learn her full name at first, just the compliance assistant, someone invisible enough to overlook, until she spoke. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't emotional, but it was precise, cutting through the polished air like something sharp and unexpected. She pointed out a discrepancy in a financial projection, a detail so small most people would have ignored it, but significant enough to ripple across the entire proposal. The room didn't react immediately, but Victor did. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the kind of movement only someone watching closely would notice, and for a brief second, the illusion of control flickered. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's an interesting observation," he said, his voice calm, measured, practiced. "Though I'd expect someone in your position to understand the broader context before raising concerns in a room like this." A few people shifted in their seats, subtle glances exchanged, the unspoken rule settling back into place. Know where you stand. Clara didn't respond right away. She didn't apologize, didn't shrink, didn't explain herself. She simply met his gaze, her eyes steady, unreadable, as if she had already calculated something no one else in the room could see. The silence stretched just long enough to make it uncomfortable, just long enough for Victor to decide that this would not be allowed to stand. "In fact," he continued, turning slightly so the entire room could hear him more clearly, "why don't you walk us through your analysis? Let's see if there's actually substance behind the interruption." A few quiet chuckles followed, not loud, not cruel, but enough. Enough to mark the moment. Enough to draw a line. Clara rose slowly, not rushed, not hesitant, her movements controlled in a way that didn't match the way people expected someone like her to behave. She walked to the front of the room, past polished shoes and tailored suits, past eyes that had already decided how this would end. And still, something about her composure felt out of place, like a note slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect melody. Victor watched her closely now, no longer dismissive, but curious in a way he didn't fully understand. Because for the first time, there was no fear in her posture, no urgency to prove herself, just quiet certainty. And somewhere beneath the surface, something had already begun to shift. Clara reached the front of the room and turned toward the screen, her reflection faintly visible against the glass wall behind it, the city stretching out beneath them in quiet indifference. And for a brief moment no one spoke, not even Victor, who had expected hesitation, perhaps even embarrassment, but not this composed stillness that seemed to settle around her like it belonged there. She placed her notebook on the table without opening it, her hands resting lightly at her sides as if she did not need to rely on anything written down. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without forcing itself. "The discrepancy appears in the third quarter projection," she said, her eyes moving briefly toward the screen before returning to the room, not seeking approval, not asking permission, simply stating what was already there. A few executives leaned forward, their expressions shifting from mild amusement to cautious attention as she continued, outlining the numbers with quiet precision, connecting figures that had been presented as stable but now revealed subtle inconsistencies when viewed together. Victor remained still, his expression controlled, but his fingers tapped once against the glass table, a small, almost imperceptible movement that betrayed the tightening tension beneath his polished exterior. Clara did not rush. She did not over-explain. She spoke as though she trusted the room to follow, and slowly, it did. The numbers aligned, the pattern emerged, and what had been dismissed as a minor interruption began to take shape as something far less convenient. One of the senior analysts shifted in his chair, glancing toward Victor before looking back at the screen, as if recalculating something in real time. Another executive adjusted her glasses, her earlier smile gone, replaced by a focused frown. Clara paused just long enough for the silence to settle again, not awkward this time, but heavy with recognition. It does not invalidate the entire proposal, she added, her tone even, almost considerate, but it does change the level of risk. The words hung in the air, not dramatic, not accusatory, just undeniable. Victor finally stepped forward, reclaiming the center of the room with a practiced ease that had carried him through countless situations like this, though something in his posture had shifted, subtle but real. Risk is always a factor, he said smoothly, his voice regaining its authority, though now it carried a sharper edge. That is why leadership exists, to interpret data within context, not to isolate fragments and present them as conclusions. A few nods followed, hesitant but familiar, the room instinctively aligning itself back toward him, toward certainty, toward hierarchy. Clara met his gaze again, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before, not defiance, not fear, but clarity, as if she had already anticipated this response. Context matters, she agreed quietly, and for a moment it almost sounded like concession, like she was stepping back into the role everyone expected her to occupy, but then she added, which is why the source of the data is important. The shift was subtle, but it landed. Victor's smile faltered for the briefest second, so quickly most would have missed it, but not everyone. Not the analyst who had been recalculating, not the executive who had stopped taking notes, and certainly not Clara, who stood there without raising her voice, without changing her posture, simply allowing the implication to exist. The room did not erupt. No one spoke out of turn. But something had changed, something small and quiet and irreversible, like the first crack in glass that still looked whole until the light hit it just right. And in that moment, Victor Langston understood that this was no longer just an interruption. It was the beginning of something he could not yet see clearly, but already felt slipping beyond his control. The room did not recover immediately, even after Victor's words settled into the air, because something in Clara's final statement refused to fade, lingering just beneath the surface like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. And for the first time that morning, the attention in the room was no longer directed solely at power, but at possibility. Victor adjusted his stance, his confidence returning in controlled layers, the kind built over years of commanding rooms exactly like this, and he gave a small, dismissive nod toward the screen as if to reset the moment. "We will review the source data internally," he said, his tone firm, decisive, signaling closure, signaling that the discussion had reached its limit. "For now, we stay focused on the larger objective." A few executives quickly echoed the shift, typing again, nodding, realigning themselves with the direction they knew was safest, but not everyone moved so easily. The senior analyst who had been watching Clara leaned back slightly, his brow furrowed, clearly no longer convinced that the issue could be brushed aside so cleanly. Clara, however, did not push further. She did not argue or insist or attempt to hold the floor. Instead, she simply nodded once, as if she had expected this exact response, and returned to her seat without another word. That, more than anything, unsettled Victor. He had seen defiance before. He had dismantled it, redirected it, absorbed it into his authority. But this was different. There was no resistance to crush, no emotional reaction to exploit, just quiet compliance that felt less like surrender and more like timing. The meeting continued, but the rhythm had changed. Conversations felt slightly off, like each comment now carried a second layer beneath it, and Victor noticed it in the way people glanced at the numbers, in the way they hesitated just a fraction longer before agreeing. By the time the session ended, the polished certainty that had filled the room at the start had thinned into something more fragile. As chairs slid back and quiet conversations resumed, Victor remained at the head of the table, watching as people filtered out, his gaze briefly landing on Clara as she gathered her notebook. She did not rush. She did not linger. She simply moved with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all morning, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Ms. Whitmore," Victor called, his voice calm, controlled, but edged with something sharper now. She stopped and turned, meeting his eyes without hesitation. A word. The room cleared quickly, the unspoken understanding of hierarchy sending everyone else out into the hallway, leaving only the two of them and the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Victor stepped closer, not aggressively, but with deliberate presence, the kind meant to remind someone exactly where they stood. "You made a bold choice today," he said, his tone measured, almost conversational, but beneath it was a clear warning. "Interrupting a presentation at that level is not something I take lightly." Clara listened without interrupting, her expression neutral, her posture steady. "I did not intend to interrupt," she replied quietly. "I intended to clarify." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her now with a focus he had not given her before, as if trying to determine whether this calm was genuine or calculated. "Clarity," he repeated, a faint smile returning, though this one carried no warmth, "is a matter of perspective." Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, and in that silence, something passed between them, something unspoken but understood. "So is reputation," she said softly. The words were not loud. They were not dramatic, but they landed with a weight that did not belong to someone in her position, and for the first time, Victor did not respond immediately. He simply stood there, watching her, as the faint reflection of both of them stretched across the glass wall behind them, and somewhere in that reflection, the balance had already begun to shift. Victor did not speak again after that, not immediately, and Clara did not wait for him to. She simply gave a small nod as if the conversation had reached its natural end and walked past him with the same steady pace she had carried all morning, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any raised voice ever could. The hallway outside the conference room buzzed with low conversations, the kind that tried to sound casual but carried an unmistakable edge of curiosity, and as Clara stepped into it, a few heads turned, quickly looking away as if they had not been watching her at all. She moved through them without acknowledgement, her focus fixed forward, her expression unchanged, but behind her, the whispers had already begun to form, subtle at first, then gathering shape as fragments of the meeting spread from one person to another. Victor remained inside for several seconds longer, his reflection staring back at him from the glass wall, composed, controlled, exactly as it had always been, yet something about it now felt less certain, like an image that no longer aligned perfectly with reality. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, the conversations shifted almost instantly, voices lowering, posture straightening, the familiar current of authority reasserting itself, but the undercurrent did not disappear entirely. It lingered just beneath the surface, quiet but present. By the time Victor reached his office, the first email had already arrived. It was brief, professional, sent from the senior analyst who had been in the meeting, requesting access to the original data set referenced in the morning presentation, noting a need for verification. Victor read it once, then again, his expression unreadable as he set his phone down on the polished desk. Within minutes, a second message followed, this time from legal, asking for clarification on documentation tied to the same projections. The timing was not coincidental. It was too precise. Victor leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he considered the sequence, not the content, but the pattern, because patterns were what built empires and what destroyed them. Across the building, Clara sat at her desk in a quieter section of the floor, far removed from the executive offices, where the lighting was less polished and the pace less performative. Her workspace was simple, organized, nothing that drew attention, and she moved through her tasks with the same quiet efficiency she always had, answering emails, reviewing documents, maintaining the appearance of someone who had returned to normal. But her screen told a different story. Multiple windows were open, each containing fragments of information that, on their own, seemed routine, but together formed something far more deliberate. Timestamps, revisions, internal communications, archived reports, each piece aligned with careful precision. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Every movement of her cursor was intentional. Every file opened exactly when it needed to be, as if she had already mapped out each step long before that meeting ever began. In another part of the building, Victor's assistant knocked lightly before stepping into his office, her posture careful, her voice measured. "There are a few additional inquiries coming in," she said, placing a small stack of printed emails on his desk. "Mostly internal, but they are starting to reference the same issue." Victor glanced at the papers, then back at her, his expression calm, controlled, but the silence that followed carried something sharper now, something calculating. "Handle them," he said evenly. Standard response. No deviations. She nodded and stepped back, closing the door quietly behind her. But even as the latch clicked into place, the room did not feel as contained as it once had. Somewhere in the building, unseen but already in motion, something had shifted from a single moment into a chain reaction, and for the first time in a long time, Victor Langston was no longer the one controlling how it would unfold. By late afternoon, the building no longer felt like a place of routine execution, but something far more unsettled, as if invisible threads had begun pulling at carefully constructed layers that had once seemed immovable. And while no announcement had been made, no formal concern declared, the shift was undeniable to anyone paying attention. Emails moved faster, replies came with more caution, and conversations that once carried certainty now paused at the edges of implication, as though every word might carry consequences no one fully understood yet. Victor sat behind his desk, the skyline stretching wide beyond his office windows, but his attention remained fixed on the steady flow of information appearing before him, each message more precise than the last, each request framed professionally, yet pointing in the same direction. Verification, clarification, documentation, words that sounded harmless on their own, yet together formed a pattern that could not be ignored. He responded to none of them personally. Instead, he reviewed, calculated, and observed, allowing his team to maintain the appearance of control while he considered the deeper structure beneath it all. Because this was no longer about a single discrepancy. It was about origin. And origin, once questioned, had a way of unraveling everything tied to it. Across the building, Clara remained exactly where she had always been, her presence quiet, her role unchanged in the eyes of those who still saw only what they expected to see. But beneath that surface, her work had shifted into something far more deliberate. She moved between systems with careful precision, accessing records that required clearance levels she seemed to navigate without hesitation, her familiarity with the internal architecture revealing itself not through display, but through efficiency. Every file she opened connected to another, every document aligned with a timeline that stretched further back than anyone in that morning meeting had considered relevant. She was not searching. She was confirming. A small notification appeared on her screen, an internal audit flag triggered automatically by one of the earlier inquiries, and she paused for a fraction of a second before opening it, her eyes scanning the details with the same calm focus she had maintained all day. It was beginning. Not loudly, not dramatically, but precisely as expected. In Victor's office, another knock came, softer this time, followed by his assistant stepping in with a controlled urgency that did not need to be spoken. "Compliance has initiated a preliminary review," she said, placing a single document on his desk rather than a stack, as if its weight alone was enough. Victor looked down at it, his expression unchanged, but the stillness that followed carried more meaning than any reaction could have. He did not reach for the document immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting toward the glass wall, where the reflection of his office met the fading light outside, and for the first time that day, the certainty that had defined him felt less absolute. Not gone, but challenged. "Who authorized it?" he asked finally, his voice even, controlled, as though the answer itself would not matter. His assistant hesitated, just briefly, before responding. "It appears to have been triggered internally, sir. Automated process, but..." She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "It is linked to the data source referenced earlier." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, as the pieces aligned not in isolation, but in sequence, each step following the last with deliberate precision. This was not random. This was not reactive. It was structured. Somewhere between that meeting and this moment, a process had been set into motion that did not rely on confrontation, did not seek permission, and did not require visibility to gain momentum. And in another part of the building, Clara closed one window and opened another, her movements steady, her expression unchanged, as the system continued to respond exactly as it was designed to do, one trigger leading to the next, each step reinforcing the last. She did not smile. She did not pause, because this was never about a single moment. It was about timing, and the moment had already passed. The building grew quieter as the evening approached, but it was not the calm of completion. It was the kind of quiet that follows the realization that something has already shifted beyond repair, and in offices across multiple floors, screens remained lit longer than usual. Conversations lowered into careful tones, and decisions that once took seconds now lingered under second thought. Victor had not left his office. The city outside had begun to glow with the soft amber of sunset, but inside, the light felt colder, sharper, reflecting off glass and steel, as if the space itself had become more exposed. The document his assistant had placed on his desk remained open now, its contents reviewed not once, but multiple times, each line revealing less about the numbers themselves and more about the structure beneath them. The audit trail was clean on the surface, but too clean, with revisions aligned too perfectly, approvals appearing in sequences that followed authority but not logic. It was not proof of wrongdoing. Not yet. But it was enough to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny, once formalized, could not be redirected by influence alone. Victor reached for his phone, his movements measured, deliberate, and placed a call not to his assistant, not to legal, but to someone outside the immediate structure, someone who understood how to contain situations before they expanded. The call connected, and his voice remained calm, controlled, but beneath it was a tone that had not been there before, not urgency, but calculation under pressure. "I need a review contained," he said, choosing each word carefully. Internal, limited visibility. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a response too low to hear, but Victor's expression did not change. "It is already flagged," he added, as if clarifying the stakes. Another pause, longer this time, and when the call ended, he set the phone down slowly, his gaze drifting once more toward the glass wall, where the reflection staring back at him now felt less like confirmation and more like question. Across the building, Clara remained at her desk, though most of her floor had begun to empty, the usual end-of-day routine unfolding around her without interruption. A few colleagues gathered their things, exchanging polite goodbyes, glancing briefly in her direction before moving on, unaware that the quiet woman they had barely noticed was now at the center of something far larger than any of them realized. Her screen displayed a series of confirmations, system responses cascading one after another, each triggered by the last, each reinforcing the structure she had set into motion hours earlier. She opened a final file, not because she needed to, but because it completed the sequence, a record that connected origin, revision, and approval into a single, unbroken chain. She reviewed it once, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, then saved it to a location that did not draw attention, yet ensured it could not be easily dismissed. She leaned back slightly in her chair, not in relief, but in quiet acknowledgement. The process no longer required her. In another office, two executives sat across from each other, reviewing the same data from different angles, their conversation cautious, their conclusions unspoken but forming. In legal, a draft request for further documentation was prepared, then revised, then prepared again, each version more precise than the last. And in Victor's office, the weight of control continued to shift, not in a single moment, but in accumulation, as each system, each department, each individual response moved independently yet in alignment, creating something that no longer belonged to any one person. The night settled over the city, but inside the building, the consequences of the day did not rest. They expanded, quietly, methodically, and without need for announcement. And somewhere within that expansion, Victor Langston began to understand that this was not a situation he could silence, because it had never depended on noise to begin with. By the time the next morning arrived, the building no longer carried the illusion of normalcy. Even though every routine remained technically intact, people still arrived on time. Coffee machines hummed, elevators opened and closed with the same quiet precision. But beneath it all there was a tension that no one could quite name, yet everyone could feel, as if something invisible had shifted overnight and now lingered in every interaction, every glance, every pause before speaking. Victor entered. Through the main lobby with his usual composed stride, his presence still commanding attention, but the reactions around him had changed in ways that were subtle enough to deny and obvious enough to notice. Greetings came a fraction later. Eye contact broke a second sooner, and the quiet confidence that once followed him like certainty now carried a faint hesitation. He did not acknowledge it. He moved forward, past polished marble and reflective glass, into the private elevator that carried him directly to the executive floor, where control had always been unquestioned. But as the doors closed, his reflection met him again, and this time, it did not offer reassurance. Upstairs, the situation had already progressed beyond what any single conversation could contain. Overnight, the preliminary review had expanded, not through confrontation, but through process, each flag detail triggering another, each request generating a response that required verification, and by early morning, compliance, legal, and internal audit were no longer working in parallel. They were intersecting. Meetings were scheduled quietly, without announcement. Documents were requested with increased specificity, and the language in internal communications had shifted from exploratory to formal. Victor stepped into his office and immediately noticed the difference, not in what was present, but in what was waiting. A folder sat at the center of his desk, thicker than the one from the previous day, accompanied by a single note from legal requesting his availability for a review session later that morning. He read it once, then set it down, his expression unchanged, but the silence that followed carried weight. Across the building, Clara arrived at her desk at the same time she always did, her routine unaltered, her presence still quiet, still unnoticed by most. But the system she had set into motion no longer required her proximity to continue. She logged in, reviewed a few standard tasks, responded to routine emails, and for anyone watching, it would have appeared that nothing about her had changed, but her awareness had shifted. She did not need to search for updates. She understood exactly where the process would be by now. A colleague approached her desk briefly, mentioning something about increased document requests from audit. The tone casual, the curiosity unguarded, but Clara only nodded lightly, offering no additional reaction, her attention returning to her screen as if the information held no significance beyond routine. In reality, it confirmed timing. Back in the executive wing, Victor entered the scheduled meeting with the same controlled presence he had always carried, but the room waiting for him was different. Legal counsel sat at one end of the table, compliance at the other, audit positioned between them, and for the first time, the structure of authority did not center around him. It surrounded him. The discussion began formally, measured, with language that avoided accusation but did not avoid implication, references to data origin, approval sequences, and reporting consistency framed as questions rather than conclusions, yet each question pointed in the same direction. Victor responded as he always had, calmly, precisely, offering explanations that had once been sufficient, but now met with follow-up questions that did not yield as easily, each answer requiring more detail, more clarity, more traceability. The room remained quiet, professional, controlled, but the balance had shifted. No one raised their voice. No one challenged him directly. And yet, for the first time, Victor Langston was not leading the conversation. He was inside it. And as the meeting continued, as documents were reviewed and timelines examined, it became clear that whatever had begun the day before had now reached a point where it no longer depended on perception or authority, but on record, and record, once examined closely enough, had a way of telling its own story, whether anyone intended it to or not. The room did not erupt when the final document was placed on the table. There was no dramatic shift in tone, no raised voices, no sudden confrontation, and yet the impact of what had just been revealed carried more weight than any outburst ever could, because this time, there was no room left for interpretation. The audit lead slid a single page forward, its contents concise, structured, and supported by a chain of documentation that no longer relied on assumption. Timestamps aligned with access logs, revisions traced back to specific approvals, and the origin of the altered data was no longer abstract. It was defined. Victor did not reach for the paper immediately. He did not need to. He had already seen enough in the previous documents to understand what this one would confirm. Still, after a moment, he leaned forward and glanced down, his expression steady, controlled, but the silence that followed was no longer his to command. Across the table, legal remained composed, compliance remained precise, and audit remained neutral, but none of them deferred. They simply waited, not for permission, not for direction, but for acknowledgement. Victor exhaled slowly, setting his hands flat on the table as if grounding himself in the only structure that still felt solid. "This appears to be a misinterpretation of procedural overlap," he said, his tone measured, his words carefully selected, but even as he spoke, the certainty behind them no longer carried the same authority. "The sequence can be explained within operational context." The audit lead nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition of the statement, and then responded with the same calm precision that had defined the entire process. "The sequence has been reviewed across multiple systems," she said. "The consistency of the pattern suggests intentional alignment rather than procedural overlap. No accusation, no escalation, just fact." The room fell into a silence that felt final, not because anything had ended, but because everything had already been decided by the record itself. Victor leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting for the first time not toward the people in the room, but toward the documents, as if searching for something that had been missed, some detail that could still be reframed, redirected, contained. But there was none, because this had never been built on a single point of failure. It had been constructed in layers, each one reinforcing the next, each one designed to stand on its own if necessary. Across the building, Clara sat quietly at her desk, the same gray cardigan draped neatly over her chair, her notebook resting where it always had, and her screen now returned to routine tasks, emails, scheduling, standard reports, the kind of work that defined her role in the eyes of everyone around her. A colleague passed by, mentioning something about increased executive meetings, the tone curious, almost excited, but Clara only gave a small nod, her attention remaining on her screen, her expression unchanged. She did not check for updates. She did not need to. The process had reached its natural conclusion. Back in the executive conference room, the final statement was delivered without emphasis, without performance, but with a clarity that left no space for interpretation. "Based on the findings, this will move to formal review," legal stated, her voice steady, professional, final. Victor did not respond immediately. For the first time, there was no immediate counter, no redirection, no assertion of control. He simply sat there, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of the table, no longer the dominant presence in the room, but a figure now defined by the very system he had once controlled. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside one glass tower among many. But within those walls, something irreversible had occurred. Not loudly, not publicly, but completely. And as the meeting adjourned, as chairs moved back and documents were gathered with quiet efficiency, the room carried a silence that no longer belonged to hesitation, but to conclusion, the kind that did not need to be spoken because it had already been recorded. The news did not break all at once, and that was what made it impossible to control, because it did not arrive as a single headline that could be managed or dismissed, but as a series of quiet confirmations that spread through the company, then beyond it, each one reinforcing the last until the narrative no longer belonged to any one voice. By midweek, the internal review had escalated into a formal inquiry, and while no official statement had been released publicly, the signals were clear to anyone watching closely. Board members requested private briefings, external auditors were quietly engaged, and meetings that once included Victor at the center were now scheduled without his input. He still occupied his office, still carried the title that had once defined his authority, but the structure around him had shifted in a way that could not be reversed by presence alone. Conversations no longer paused when he entered, they redirected, careful, measured, but no longer aligned with him by default. In the executive hallway, doors that had once opened freely now closed with softer deliberation, and the subtle rhythm of power had changed from certainty to distance. Victor moved through it all with the same composed exterior he had always maintained, his posture unchanged, his voice steady in the few meetings he still attended. But beneath that surface, the control he had relied on was no longer responsive in the same way. Questions were no longer answered with immediate agreement. Explanations were no longer accepted without verification, and every statement now existed alongside a record that could be reviewed independently of him. Across the building, Clara remained exactly where she had always been, her role unchanged, her presence still quiet enough to be overlooked by those who had never learned to look closely. She arrived on time, completed her tasks, responded to emails with the same calm professionalism, and when colleagues mentioned the ongoing situation in cautious tones, she listened without adding to the speculation, her attention returning to her work as if none of it concerned her at all. But in the system, in the records that continued to move through departments and reviews, her work remained precise, structured, and impossible to separate from the outcome now unfolding. Late one afternoon, as the building settled into a quieter pace, Victor stood alone in his office, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, its movement constant, indifferent, unchanged by the shift that had taken place within these walls. On his desk sat a single document, not thick, not complex, but definitive, outlining the next steps in the formal process, steps that no longer required his approval to proceed. He read it once, then placed it back down with the same controlled motion he had used his entire career, but the stillness that followed carried something different now, not uncertainty, but recognition. Across the floor, Clara packed her bag at the end of the day, her notebook slipping neatly inside, her chair pushed in with quiet precision, and as she walked toward the elevator, she passed conversations that softened as she moved by, not because they recognized her role, but because the atmosphere itself had changed. The elevator doors closed, reflecting her calm expression back at her for a brief moment before carrying her downward, away from the floor where everything had begun. She did not look back. She did not need to, because the outcome had never depended on her standing in the room when it happened. It had depended on what she set in motion when no one was watching. And in the days that followed, as the company adjusted, as roles shifted and decisions were made that could not be undone, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable, woven into every record and every consequence that followed. Respect is not enforced by power. It is revealed by how power is used. And on that day, without raising her voice, without seeking recognition, Clara Whitmore had shown exactly what that meant.